A few announcements. Just remind everyone that it's a free book festival. So after you're amazed by this discussion, go over, make a donation at the info booth, and feed yourself well with our local vendors who are providing great food. There will be questions taken at the end. And if you do have a question, just please know what your question is before you get up to the microphone, which is right there. Keep the question brief. If you have a story to tell, you can tell it to me afterwards. There also the books are available to buy right here at Bunch of Grapes, and Emily will be signing books afterwards for about 30 minutes at the signing tent, which is right behind us. So with that, I want to introduce Patricia Sullivan, who is professor of history at the University of South Carolina, focusing on modern African American history, civil rights movement, race, reform, and politics in the United States. Thanks very much. I'm going to hand it over to you, Patricia.
Is that working? Can you hear me? Great. Well, welcome to all of you. And I want to thank publicly Sue Ellen Lazarus and the many supporters and volunteers who have made the book festival possible. It is really a pleasure and delight to be here this afternoon with my dear friend and wonderful writer, Emily Bernard, to discuss her recent book, Black is the Body, Stories from My Grandmother's Time, My Mother's Time, and Mine. A beautiful, evocative, and timely work. Emily was born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee, came north to attend college at Yale, where she also received her PhD, and has been a professor of literature at the University of Vermont for about 18 years. 18 years. And she is also a writer and an essayist. Her previous books include Carl Van Vechten and the Harlem Renaissance, A Portrait in Black and White, Remember Me to Harlem, The Letters of Langston Hughes and Carl Van Vechten, and Some of My Best Friends, Writing on Interracial Friendships. Each of these books, in different ways, explore the contours and complexities of America's racial divide through the experiences of major literary and historical figures and contemporary writers. In the opening to her book on interracial friendships, she has a quote from our dear departed friend, Joe Wood, where Joe said, "The heart is raised on a mess of stories, and then it writes its own." With this memoir and collection of essays, Emily has written her stories, reflecting on her journey and experiences through the prism of life, family, memory, history, community, and more. Her book really demonstrates the power of the essay form and of memoir as a way to, in the words of Zora Neale Hurston, work towards the oldest human longing, self-revelation. But it also reminded me of another wonderful author and writer, John Hope Franklin, who called his autobiography Mirror to America. I mean, I learned so much as a historian about how to see not just her lifetime, but going back through her generations of family. This book is so, you'll see, but it is such a powerful and beautiful book. And one review I read commented, sort of captured the writing. It said, "The writing is deeply felt, unflinchingly honest, and openly questioning," which is all part of its power. So I want to open by asking if Emily would reflect with us on her journey as a writer, bringing her to this book.
Hello. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I know there are a lot of things you could be doing, and I appreciate you being here. And Pat Sullivan, who is just an extraordinary writer herself and an important figure in the history of just remembering those soldiers of the civil rights movement. So I recommend her work as well. This is a book that's really, dear to who I am. It was born a long time ago, and I write about this in the first pages of the book. It was born really, its origins took place at, it's kind of a spoiler alert or just a trigger warning, but I started out talking about, I survived a stabbing, bizarrely, when I was in graduate school. And it was a freak accident. It was, could journey back and remember the time when this didn't happen every day. And I always think, thankfully, this guy did not have a gun. But he was a paranoid schizophrenic, and I was in a coffee shop in New Haven. It's the first essay in the book. But in that book, when I started to, it took a long time to write that essay. I mean, it was just, you can imagine, it took a long time to just sort of figure out how to cope with the trauma. And one of the things the surgeon said to me right after, or said to my mother, I was kind of going in and out from the morphine, and he said, she's already telling the story of what happened, and that's the key to healing. And it's stayed with me. But the story didn't kind of just get told, and that was it. In the process, 17 years later, when I was kind of investigating the story and find out what happened, I realized that there was no unified truth. And in fact, my memory was faulty for, again, obvious reasons. There's a lot my brain wanted to protect me from in terms of the trauma. But I went through hospital records and police records and newspaper reports, and it was an entirely different story than what I had experienced. And what I had to give over was the idea that I actually owned the truth of that experience. It was something I only remembered part of, and I remembered in certain kinds of ways. And deliberately misremembering things, as some of you who've survived trauma, you know what I mean. It was out of my control, what happens, what you do. But I started to think about that experience, and I'm not exaggerating to say that writing about it was a way of coping with it, and really a way of mastering it. I have been unfortunate in that the scar tissue, and the essay is called Scar Tissue, I developed adhesions in my bowel, and my scar tissue and intestines got wrapped up together. So it was happening actually biblically every 7 years. I would have this, this welling up of this. For years I didn't know what it was. And I had that unfortunate experience with the medical establishment where I was told, it's in your head, all the things you're told. And then finally a doctor did the right test and said, this is what it is. But it's something I can't control. And I've learned that there's nothing I can do to predict or prevent these adhesions. And it's just unfortunately the way that I heal. But I had to learn to work with the pain, if you understand what I mean, and not to let it, you can shake your fist at the world for only so long, and then you have to figure out, well, how am I going to use this experience to help me live? And it, for me, became a metaphor for not only the writing of this book, but thinking about, I talk about this as, thought of it sometimes as a metaphor for the historically violent encounter between black and white in this country, and for people of color, the trauma that we hold in our bodies, and sometimes that we communicate in our stories. In the book, I'm doing a lot of, I think, wrestling with the past and the stories that my parents and before them ancestors told me to survive black in a world that historically has not recognized my humanity, but also as a kid wanting to make my own story and wanting not to be claimed by the stories of my ancestors. And of course, as I get older now and I have children of my own, they're having the same, they tell me, Mommy, you make everything about race. And I have to say, wow, I said that to my parents when I was a kid, and now let me take the lesson. So the struggle I was working with, thinking about my mother's legacy, and she was an amazing storyteller, and I heard mother before her. So many stories she told me to help me live were also stories that were very much locked in her place in time. So the question I went into in this book is, what good are these stories? And what am I saddling with my children with? What are the things that are going to enable them and liberate them to know? And what kinds of pain will I maybe be perpetuating by my memories? So that's the question I was working with, but kind of between cultures and between, being a parent and being a child, trying to figure out, what are the stories that help make us whole.
It's a wonderful beginning. Green light. Oh. Thanks a lot. Is history. And as a history teacher, my students, they're history, facts, it's something that happened then, it's static, it's set. And in your book, history and memory sort of interfaced, very dynamic, and as you explore, and so central to seeing in the present and evolving. And there are many ways that you traverse and bring these disciplines or ways of understanding together. But one thing I'd like you to talk a little bit about, we had sort of reverse experiences. I was born in New York, and I went to school in the South. I left Boston during the busing crisis, and the people said, "You're coming," you know. So I went with my eyes open and knowing that there were many problems in the North. But still, as someone, I teach in the South now, and Yankees, as my friend Virginia Durr called us, they have a real static, one-dimensional vision of the South. And again, your book opens this up in terms of your own experience, your family, your community. And I just want to read a quote, and maybe you can. You say, "I was forged in the unending conversation between Southern blacks and Southern whites." So if you could talk a bit, and then you say, "The South still claims me," looking back now. I mean, that sort of interface in your own life and thinking about history between regions and family and yourself.
There's a wonderful Langston Hughes poem called "The South," and in the poem, the speaker's kind of making a decision and decides to abandon the South. It says the bloody South for the colder mistress of the North. And I think I made that exact same decision, probably as a result of Mr. Hughes and so many other black writers I was reading, again, trying to figure out how to live my own black life. And for many of us, I think it happens when we're reading. You know, we are starting to imagine who we are. And of course, the more I stay away from the South, the more I feel it in me. And that kind of gets back, I think, to the way that I was thinking about the body as a metaphor in this book. And literally, you know, the way our bodies carry stories that, you know, we don't control. And it's in my gait, and it's in my humor. But I have not lived in the South for many, many years. And of course, the kind of South that I grew up in had not fully imagined me, which is one reason my parents encouraged me to leave. I always say I just was part of the migration, you know. I was part of that in some ways. My parents were really eager for me to go forth and find a different kind of freedom. But the South is, you know, that's where I learned to become a storyteller. And the book is very much, I think about my mother in the book, but also my grandmother. And she's a kind of person, I mean, we all have grandmothers like this, I think. You know, these incredible stories, all the things that she defied in order to live with integrity in her own life as a black woman growing up, you know, alive in the Jim Crow South as an adult, wanting to leave a tiny town in Mississippi, but unable to because she made a marriage that made it difficult for her. I always say, fortunately, and Ms. Dotsie would not disagree, she was widowed early. So she was able to have many decades ahead of her where she was free. But she lived in a way she lived her life in stories. And I think I really inherited that from her, that need to narrate my life even as I'm experiencing it. But she grew up at a time, you know, no one was interested in those stories, you know. And something that was always, it fascinates me, and I teach literature, and I will tell my students, you know, these books don't fall off of trees. And particularly when we talk about African American literature, you know, it's so recent that we're, you know, recognized as a discipline. So the mechanics behind remembering are always really interesting to me. Who gets remembered and why? And for someone like my grandmother, you know, history books were not interested in this person's life. But her life has everything to say about the South and about what it meant to be a woman and try to forge your own identity. And I have a story in here about literally her building her house. And that became central to her identity and to her body in some ways, where she could be free and have her own kitchen and live outside of the boundaries set for her by her own parents. So it's still you know, the book is, we've talked about, you know, I think a real meditation on home. And freedom. You know, something I learned from an elder, a man who's since passed away, a doctor in my community in Vermont. Very important to me. He's an African American man, and he plowed the way for many of us to live. And he taught me something about being at home. And he made it clear being at home doesn't necessarily mean being at peace. And you know, people ask me often, you know, about being black in Vermont, and you know, it's hard being black anywhere these days, as we know from watching the news, all of us in bodies that are not honored, you know, and mainstream culture, all of us who live different. I mean, it's hard. It's no easier in Vermont, probably no harder in some ways, but Larry taught me that being at home does not mean being at peace. It can mean just being committed to a struggle, right? And to deciding to write yourself into a narrative that didn't necessarily make room for you, but that you claim it. As W.E.B. Du Bois said, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. So he found a home with Shakespeare and, writers that helped make him a writer. So, I think that's something I've learned, that it's something you can make and can claim. Even if it doesn't necessarily describe who you are, you can rewrite that narrative.
I think one of the most powerful scenes in your book is returning home for your grandmother's funeral in Hazelhurst, and maybe we can talk about the church and community. Yeah. And I really, this contrast, and then your first visit to New York, and as a Southerner, and the experience on the subway, subway zombies, which you say you've now become one.
Yes, exactly.
Not touching, not looking at each other, not speaking, that sort of thing. But you mentioned your students, and I think, and then the other side, being in Vermont, being in a predominantly a university where the student body is predominantly white, and teaching African American literature. Yeah. So, and in the chapter on that, which is called The N-Word, you reflect back between 2004 and 1994. But there's, as probably for many of them the only African American professor, but trying not to be the center of the discussion, could you comment a bit about that and the sort of the challenges and the opportunities that you find in those situations?
Well, the first essay that the earliest or oldest essay in the book is an essay I wrote called Teaching the N-Word that I published in 2004. And Pat and I we're both teachers, and I was talking about my relationship to teaching, is organic. I feel I'm a teacher by profession, but also by nature. But teaching at the University of Vermont and teaching African American literature means that I have very linear work to do. My students come in at 0. And it's my job to get them to 10 by the end of the semester, and not only to introduce them to work and writers they've never heard of before, but obviously experiences, and have them understand these are American experiences. They're not exotic experiences. They're part of the fabric of this country. But it's work, and it takes it every session to get them really there. Not just nodding their heads, but really there. And it requires that I am present, but also that I disappear. I don't want my students to get kind of stopped on me in the classroom. They have to be able to learn and make mistakes. And also, they're not entitled, to my personal experience, right? I mean, but there's an important line, But on the page and in writing, I feel like there are two sides, of me. And in teaching the N-word, I didn't want to give a lecture. It's such obviously a fraught, and for some reason, persistent, problem every so often, someone says it, and then they, have to go on Oprah and say they're sorry, and then they may or may not lose their career, and then it happens again. And so, the lectures aren't working, So, I'm just always fascinated, why? And, what is the world in which that word lives, and what is attractive about it? What are the secret ways, that we are interacting with it? And so the essay form allowed me to explore. And I like the essay form because it's essentially a journey, and I wanted to just take it for a walk in all of these different areas of my life and to give that to the reader. I don't have, there's a simple answer that my grandmother would say, you can say whatever you want, I tell my students, but as Ms. Dotsie would say, don't write a check with your mouth that your behind can't cash. In other words, there are consequences for the things we say. But again, I wanted to get a little bit deeper and just think about the experience of that word and how it has affected me and people that I know and love. So the essay allows me to contradict myself and to deal in nuance and to make inappropriate jokes. And to simply just enjoy, a variety of different experiences. Where again, the classroom job I take really seriously, and it doesn't require, demand, need that, right? So the essay allows me to be free in a way that the classroom, the structure is important for my students to learn.
One comment your discussion, reflections on your students, and this is just interesting observation, I think, that's speaks to many, that they are, you said, a generation afraid to say what they see. And the difficult, it seems that we're always sort of talking about race, but not talking about race. And I think your book provides an opening for people to think about the depth and be listening. I guess that's part of it too, listening, not just talking, right? And learning through, I guess, literature and history, which you engage both.
And just, I think I have as many questions as anyone else. A story that I tell in the book in an essay called Skin is a story I told a lot aloud in my classes, and I thought, okay, this actually I think belongs in this book. I was at home with my husband, who's Italian American, and a friend of his, a white man, who'd come to hang out, spend time. And he brought his daughter, Caitlin, I call her in the book, and she was just 6 years old. And John and our friend were talking, and Caitlin, we're just sitting close to each other on the couch. And at some point, she let me know she wanted to see my ring, and so she took my hand. And then, in the course of her holding my hand, she turned my palm over, and they were sitting side by side. And Caitlin's very fair; she's got very fair blonde hair, and we were just looking at the etchings on our palms. And I realized I'd never thought about this before. Even though my husband is white, I've never really thought about the difference, in that this thing. So hers were almost invisible. We were looking, and her father, in the middle of this conversation with my husband, just took her hand away, and he did it with an apology in his eyes. I could tell that he didn't want me to feel kind of othered, to use that word. And I think he also didn't want her to see. He didn't want her to be focused on our difference there. But the problem was that she did see it. And, we sat there on the couch, I think neither of us knowing how to respond to this moment because Ben just kept talking. And, there's this current of shame that just I could feel that she felt she had done something wrong. And I thought, okay, here are all these people in this room, and everybody's trying to do the right thing. The friend was just trying to prevent what he thought would be an insult that his daughter might have delivered to me unwittingly. I was just trying to go with the flow, and he's the dad, and she was just being curious as a kid. So again, the book, I didn't want to lecture. I wanted to share those kinds of experiences because, I have as many questions as anyone else. And I think we contradict ourselves. Race is itself a contradiction. It's something that we see. We organize our lives, as Dorothy Roberts says, we make use of it every day. Even those of us, who know better, who know, okay, well, to assign characteristics to a group of people is arbitrary. But it's also something that many of us experience. I experience blackness and love blackness. At the same time, people who try to cordon off blackness into this area, you kind of say, wait a minute, it's not just that. So the storytelling, again, is a way of me getting to all of the contradictions that I live with. And try to work through by just an honest reckoning. It's all I know how to do. It's just reveal. And I like the word that you used yesterday. I like to think of the book as an invitation for the reader to feel free to also be vulnerable and to engage with their own mistakes that they have made or their own questions. I don't have any. I learn as I go, and now I have children, and I learn more, and I learn from my students about mistakes that I have made, and my daughters are living a blackness that's very different than I lived. Sometimes I have to keep my mouth shut when I am telling them things, and they are saying, "Well, actually, no, it is this," and they have a freedom to talk about race in a different way than I ever did. So, what does it mean to then be open to the newness, but at the same time, staying true to the lessons we all have learned? So that's the book I think is really asking that question, and I don't have any concrete answers.
Which is part of the power of the book. And it really is an invitation and an opening. And I think one of the stories you tell, and again, the stories are so illuminating, and it really gets to the point of interracial, marriage, and regional difference, north-south, is in interstates and about family. So would you share that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a slow writer, And Interstates begins with a scene that happened many years ago, but I'd written about in 2006, I realized. I looked back at my notes. And it just took me a long time to try to figure out what it meant. But it begins with a scene, my family, we always made the same journey. My parents were creatures of habit. So we would drive from Nashville, stop in Memphis to see my cousins, and then drive to Hazelhurst, to my mother's place of birth and where all of our family lived. And we always stopped at the same gas stations, the same restaurants. And I was too young to understand that it was because my parents had grown up in the era of Jim Crow, and they were very aware of the places where they were able to receive service without being insulted, or worse. So we followed these very predictable routes. And again, something we inherit. I do the same thing, in Vermont. I always, you park in the same place, and it's because of that. I think that growing up with that sense of order and regularity in a chaotic world. One day, my husband and I had gotten engaged, and we were driving for him to meet the family, be presented to my clan. And my father, who drove like I do, which is not terribly well, there's a tire that was losing air, and my husband, who's a very good driver, knew this, and he said, we have to pull over. And I could feel the panic in the car, because I knew why my father didn't want to pull over, and John knew too. But the tire was flat. So, and my mother and I, of course, were just see no evil here, just sitting here waiting this masculine contest. And so John, who's very hardy, got out and was under the car and changing the tire himself. And my parents and I were standing on the side of the road, and I immediately felt the vulnerability. Like, this is what they feared. We are on the side of a highway, three of us, black, and anything can happen, on I-55, and everything has happened. But for my mother, telling the story later, she just thought it was part of this new chapter that was opening in our family, because here's this white dude in our lives, and everything is now different. And how do we understand and assimilate this? I mean, won't be surprised, many of you, to know that he was not the husband my parents imagined for me. So there are a lot of I read about this in the essay about my father coming to love him and understand. For him, it was food and culture he saw as a common bond. But that essay for me is really I feel it still, my ambivalence, because this is my family, and I'm with them, and I'm with them even in their vulnerability. But John was doing something that everybody should be able to do, which is to change a tire when it's flat. I don't change tires, but you get where I'm going with that kind of symbolically. So many things I discovered my parents were living with. When we got engaged, my mother told me later, he was so afraid we wouldn't get a license. And he told my mother, I'm going to follow them in the car. I'm going to bring my bat. I have a proverbial bat, too. I told my daughter, I'm going to come down. I'm going to, And John and I were just, we didn't even think of that. And here we were in Nashville, just blithely going to get our license, And again, I felt for him, all that he was carrying and all that he was. My father and I did not have an easy relationship, as is clear in the book, but he wanted me to be free. And he wanted me to be free to have experiences, even the ones he may have wanted to warn me against. And it took a lot of courage, I think, for him to say, all right, go down to the courthouse and get that license by yourself. I had no idea what he felt he was actually putting me in. And now thinking even about all that generation, and many of you, and here many of people we know, who put those kids on the bus to go to school, and that mundane act, not knowing what was going to happen if they would come home. I didn't appreciate that until I had children. What it meant to just say, all right, we're part of this bigger project now, and we believe in it this much. So, yes, thinking about marriage and making our own stories it was a really big part of my life, and the essay's about going down south. And my southern relatives just really embracing John, because as my aunt said to me years later when we were talking this through, she remembered about John that he didn't try to, she said, hug her or call her auntie. He held out his hand for her to shake. And as I wrote in the book, he didn't presume that her body was his to touch. He held out his hand, and she, in that small gesture, she thought, okay, this person respects me as an individual and not, again, going to treat me like I belong to him in some way, or he already knows me. That handshake was an acknowledgement. You're human, I am too, and we're going to gradually come to know each other. And recently my aunt said to me, she goes, "Does John know he's white?" And it was just, we laughed about it. But I thought, well, that's, really, I mean, it's so, he is so foreign to them, in so many ways. But he was in that way, this out of the blue, but became part of our family narrative, and they still tell stories about him now. About this white Italian who came into their house and eats all their food, and so he's part of their story, and that's how they love him, and that's where I come from.
There's, again, many strong themes that unite these essays and create this powerful memoir. And so the title of your book connects with your mother and your grandmother, and your book is dedicated to your daughters. So you might comment a bit on sort of how this book, what it's sort of exploring about black women across generations within families.
Yes,
Thoughts about-
absolutely. This book is it's inherited. These stories are my parents' and grandparents' stories. I am a storyteller because of my mother, my grandmother, her mother. I wanted to address them. I wanted to remember them. I wanted to honor them in all of their complexity. But I have to say, I think in some way, very simplistically, I imagined that this book would have, be for women, And I have been appropriately chastened by the emails I've gotten from men who've said to me, "Your grandmother is my grandmother." These are stories that I have too. But I'm always, the Emily Dickinson line, I forget what poem it is, "Tell all of the truth, but tell it slant." And I think of that as such a, that is how women tell the truth in stories. There's another line that always breaks my heart. In Their Eyes Were Watching God, the main character's grandmother says, "I wanted to preach a sermon about a colored woman on high, but there was no such pulpit for me." And that line, I think, in some ways propelled me, so much, thinking it's my job now. I'm standing on these shoulders. It's my job. The pulpit is here, and I have to assume it to do that work for them, or to do the work that they started before me. But I think, again, I think I think the book for me is a very feminine refusal. I talked about not wanting to give lectures, but to kind of tell a straight-on story. My grandmother, you would ask her a direct question, she would tell you a story. And it's the way I talk too. And I think it's about also wanting to create an intimate experience between myself and my imagined reader. I came to all of these essays with questions, like the scene with my husband on the side of the road. I didn't know what it meant. I still, it belongs to readers as much as it does me. I had to learn what it meant through writing about it and sharing it with other people. And I think that's what my ambition in the book is, to say, have you had this experience? What is your take on it? How do you understand your own life? It's just the beginning for me. But the book is also about remembering the people who lived lives on the margins, and didn't have the institutions dedicated to their memory, but lived fully and in complex ways. Again, the story of my grandmother and how she built that house brick by brick, enlisting men when she had to, but also making sure it was her house. To me, it's the metaphor of just trying to build this book and how we build our lives. So many of us who don't have a lot of luxuries, of time and of independence sometimes, but we make them anyway. And within relationships, I think that's really classic. That happens to us as women. We're always, even in slave narratives, it's the women who say they have children, and you can't be free in the same way if you have children. But if you can walk away with no attachments, freedom is a different experience for women, I think. And the book is in the largest way trying to recognize that and give that room.
Oh, there's somebody over here who's talking to us. That's it. Okay, are we 10 minutes out?
You're about 5 minutes out.
Oh,
or
5
so.
minutes. Oh, dear. Okay. So we'd like to invite questions from you all. We have a few minutes. And there are mics.
Say if you have a question to come to the mic, but I can see that you cannot come to the mic.
Oh.
You mentioned your daughters. Could you say a few words about raising interracial children, mixed children, particularly in Vermont? That also presents challenges that you might not face.
It's my next book. I'm kidding. It's a big question. Actually, my daughters, I did not give birth to my children. we adopted our daughters from Ethiopia. So that's another layer of the story, and I write about it in here. And thinking about identity, I mean, I love that question because my daughters, and so I watch them make up their own stories. I have one who's very identified with John, my husband, and she has said to me, you're the only one in the family who's not Italian. And I was like, okay, I'll let that go. So, but she loves, that's her person, and, I sometimes ask her for advice. What would you say to Daddy? And she, so that's who she's identified with, and that is it. That's the story. For now, it's a complicated story, but I watch them and see how they've got a whole cast of characters from here to Ethiopia, people who are claiming them all over the world, and I watch them decide who is their family and who they belong to. It's a decision they have made. Of course, there are so many ways in which they're twins, which is another chapter. They belong to each other exclusively, in a way they don't to really anyone else. But, it's an ongoing story, and being a 13-year-old black girl in Vermont is complicated. And so they are living that every day, and we have talks about it all the time, about what it is like for them. One of them has decided to be the race warrior at her school, and you will be corrected, if you slip up in Julia's presence, and another one is finding it really hard. So my job, is just watching it happen, and, it's easy to pack your bags. The world is a big place. But, we all talk about home a lot and what it would cost us if we were left and what is not necessarily guaranteed if we were to leave. So, they're living, they're in the book, so this book really belongs to them. They often come with me. Sometimes they take questions. And they're I think, I'm watching them and learning, really, as their life unfolds.
So I think we can all appreciate. Closer? Is that okay? I think we can all appreciate the conversation about issues of race in the U.S. context.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you're going to try to help your children understand the role of the Italians in Ethiopia.
Oh, absolutely. We talk
So
about
how
it all.
you kind of talk about that.
Yeah,
Thanks.
no, it's a big story. My husband, he's a historian, and so they are. We're a family of talkers, so they understand all of it. My children. They are overhearing conversations and part of conversations, and they know that none of these stories is simple. But they are very much They are the authors of their own narratives, and they will tell you what it means for them to be identified with Italy, and what they know of Italy are Italian relatives who love them, and the sun rises and sets on these two girls, and who don't see them as foreign, who decided these are our grandchildren, and that was happening before they even came along. So, their experience to me is they lead the way in deciding what is most salient to them.
You all are, if there's another question, just pop up. We have a few more minutes, but we were talking last night, and again, at the press discussion first thing yesterday, the commentator said, race is central to this country. Discussions of who we are and where we are going during this election, race is at the center. How this country struggles to talk about race. And I think, again, your book is an invitation. There's a lot of talk about race. Understanding is something else. Questioning is something else. So how do you see your book? And you talked about finishing it after the election of 2016. Right. At this particular moment, I think it has an enormous role to play in opening instead of closing. You talk about the fear associated with talking about race, how the students are afraid to speak up because they don't want to seem that they don't know, and just not having the questions. So.
Right. The 2016 election was pivotal. As pivotal for me as it was for anyone else in this room. And really, as a parent, having to explain to my daughters, I'll never forget that. The next morning, what happened? I really feel like childhood ended in that day. They get all kinds of lectures about bullying at school. Now a bully is the president. So I'll end that. I needed a place to go, and I needed to remember that people are good. And I needed a place to be loving and to be vulnerable. and this book became a place for me. The choice between staying silent and then ending up under the bed, just hoping it'll all go away. There was that choice and the choice to live, and the choice to try to be active and to contribute to a healing conversation and a positive and a hard conversation, but the necessary conversation, truth-telling and honesty. That's what this book represents to me. I mean, it really helped me focus and live in a positive way. Is what I used it for, and what it helped me do. As opposed to staying silent and getting calcified in anger. The classroom is important. I tell my students, we're practicing now good citizenship. That's what we're doing in the classroom above anything else. And this book, to me, is really about trying to be active and practice those principles, in the storytelling and the way that I wanted to approach these knotty issues. So it was essential. Yeah.
I think that sort of ties in. Judge Richard Gergel is here, and he has a concept. But I was thinking about your book in this context, what you just said, and what it invites us to do at civic courage.
Yeah.
About facing our past.
Right.
But you show the complications, and again, this sort of interracial, these boundaries that are fluid, that are real, but difficult and not easily described, right? They're situational, and the capacity of people to grow. But to grow, you have to have courage. You have to look at the past. I mean, I think history is all through your book. And as James Baldwin said, if you don't know what happened behind you, you have no idea what's going on around you. And that's why I'm glad I'm a history teacher, but they're like, oh, history, forget it. But so it's a challenge and an opportunity. But any final comments you'd like to make?
Let's see. I'm not sure. I think we've covered a lot of things here.
How's the reception to the book been?
The reception has been, it's been really thrilling. And the most exciting thing is, making connections with readers. You're finishing a book, as many of you know in here, and you're trying to dot your I's and cross your T's and, make sure the metaphors really work. And then there are readers, people who, and what I've loved is people sharing their own stories with me. I've heard so many stories. I mean, again, my grandmother apparently is, so the grandmother of many people. And as James Baldwin said, also, you think your pain is unique in the history of the world, and then you read. I'm paraphrasing. So it's also been true, I think, of sharing my own stories. It's, we're all in this together, and that has been a great gift that this book has given me. Yeah.
And that you have given us with your book. So join me in thanking Emily Bernard.
Thank you.